Welcome to this week's Autism News. I am kicking things off today with some sports news coming out of Kent State. Last year, Kent State made news when Kalin Bennett made history as the first autistic player to sign with a Division I school. This year, he has made history again as the first autistic basketball player to make a basket in a Division I college game. Bennett's mother says that when he was originally diagnosed at a very young age, she was told that he would never talk or walk and that she should put him in a facility. His mother did not feel that that was the right choice for her son, and so she said no. She felt like her son had the ability to do great things, and she said she wasn't just going to throw her hands up in the air and give up on him. Bennett began to speak at the age of 7, and in 3rd grade he told his mom that he wanted to play basketball. Well, this was initially terrifying news to his mother. Through a great deal of hard work, it has led to some very great things for him. A small study in the journal Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine has been published, looking at adults who are diagnosed as being autistic later in life. In the study, they interviewed 9 people over the age of 50 who had been recently diagnosed. 5 of the people in the study were women and 4 were men. When they were asked about why they had sought a diagnosis out, 3 of the participants said that it was because their children had been diagnosed, and when their children were diagnosed they recognized similar signs in themselves, and the rest of them had it suggested to them that they be tested by either loved ones or therapists. All of the participants in the study had been treated for anxiety and depression. Several traits repeatedly came up in the interviews, including difficulty fitting in, repetitive behaviors, and fondness for routine. Difficulty making friends was another very common trait. Feeling alien or like a bad person because of struggles to fit in with other people, and feelings of isolation were also very common. One of the conclusions of the study was that even if someone has lived their entire life without a diagnosis, that getting that diagnosis can be a very positive experience for an adult. This study is coming out of Australia and the Telethon Kids Institute. It is the largest study of its kind with more than 2,000 kids, and it found that 1 in 3 kids who are on the spectrum have significant movement difficulties. And yet, at the same time, only 1% of kids who are on the spectrum have a diagnosed movement condition. The lead investigator of the study, Andrew Whitehouse, says that this isn't because of a sinister intention. It's just when there are tests being done for an autism diagnosis, people are so focused on the core features of autism that these movement difficulties often get overlooked. Somewhere between 50 to 80% of autistic people are thought to have some sort of movement problem, such as clumsiness or an unusual gait, but how prevalent this is varies from study to study. This is really the first study like this that has a large sample size to draw conclusions from. I found this really interesting because for us, both Tessie and Maggie tend to score pretty well on gross motor skills, and actually they also do okay with fine motor skills when they're trying. When they're really focused on doing something, they tend to be okay. Even with Sadie, they're talking at school now about how athletic she is. She has really good handwriting now after a lot of practice. When she really focuses on something, she tends to do really well with her motor skills now. However, I would say just about everyone in our family is extremely clumsy, as in what they used to say in OT about pretty much all of our girls was that they might go and climb something and do some gross motor thing that was super complicated and really hard to do for their age, and then they were just as likely to walk across the room and fall down when they were walking across an open space. And that is kind of the story of all of our kids. When they're focused on the way that they're moving, they tend to be able to do hard things, but it needs that conscious thought or things often go wrong. In Utah, a bus driver was caught on camera abusing a 13-year-old autistic girl who is nonverbal and blind. I have read a couple of different articles about this story, and they are all extremely disturbing. There are different levels of graphic description out there about how he wrestled her down, said cruel things to her, had hit her on multiple occasions because when she was startled, by a loud noise on the bus, she started to panic and melt down, basically, and that sometimes when she would melt down, she would pull hair if it was near her. It sounded like she was pretty frightened, but that there were de-escalation techniques that were in her IEP, that the paraprofessionals that were with her didn't know them, hadn't read her IEP, and that in one of the articles that I read, it said she was supposed to be in a harness, but she was not in a harness, and that's pretty big too. He also pushed her down onto her stomach, onto the seat when he was wrestling her down and jerking her arm around, which face down holds are also a big no-no. I believe they're against state law in Utah. All in all, it was a pretty bad situation. I mean, he was hitting her in the head, and it was thankfully caught on camera. The de-escalation techniques that usually worked for the girl included counting backwards from 50 and singing to her. The man had been a bus driver for neurotypical children for 4 years with the district, but had recently been transferred over to drive special education students without training. And I came across an article about a situation in the UK that was really startling. It began with a father talking about how his 15-year-old daughter was placed in an isolation room where she could only be touched through a tiny hatch that they would have to basically kneel down and reach through when she was in the care of a mental health hospital for 2 years. The Joint Committee on Human Rights says that mental health hospitals can inflict terrible suffering on those detained, causing anguish to their distraught families, and they put forth a report that is urging the overhaul of mental health law and hospital inspections in England. The chair of the committee says that it cannot be allowed to continue. The parents in the original story, who could only see their daughter through that hatch, campaigned for her to be moved somewhere more appropriate, and since she was not even receiving any sort of treatment in that hospital, she was just alone by herself in that room for 2 years. And she was briefly sent to an adolescent unit where her family said they did brilliant work. She was out in the community, she got to go on walks with her dogs, and it was brilliant. But as soon as she turned 18, she could no longer stay there, and she was transferred to an adult medium security unit that did not specialize in autism, where she deteriorated massively and was back in a cell. The other cell had a hatch and this one does not, so they can't even hold her hand now. According to the law in England, young people who have learning disabilities or mental health issues or autism who are detained in a mental health hospital must have treatment that is necessary, appropriate, and available. But there was an inquiry that was launched back in January that heard evidence that there is, quote, a significant increase in distress and a worsening of symptoms for those detained, particularly where segregation and restraint have been used, according to the BBC. We are concerned that a broad approach has been taken to the appropriate medical treatment requirement, and the approach appears to be that the most basic provision of care satisfies this test, the committee says. We consider the human rights of many of those with a learning disability and or autism are being breached in mental health hospitals. One young man told the inquiry that he remembers his time in a mental health hospital as some sort of nightmare that does not feel real. He said that he had no care, he was put in a room to basically sleep. Another had his arm snapped in a restraint, and it was 24 hours before care was sought for his injury. For one boy who had anxiety and sensory issues, he would not be allowed out of a locked room until he was completely quiet, and that led him to being locked up for around 9 hours at a time. When families object to these treatments, they are treated as hostile and a problem and are excluded from the decision-making process. The committee said that it had lost confidence in the system that is doing what it says it is doing, and that there is urgent need for reform. A list of demands were given, including a unit to safeguard the human rights of young people with learning disabilities and autism, an overhaul of inspections to include covert surveillance and unannounced visits, and that only individuals who will benefit from treatment will be detained in mental health hospitals, and that families will be fully involved in decisions. This will be driven forward urgently, and I hope it is. That whole situation sounds horrifying, to have to make that decision of having to have a child hospitalized and then to end up in the situation where you can't be involved in the decisions and to know that they aren't getting the help that they need while they're in the hospital. Anyways, I've gone on for long enough. That is it for today. If you like this video, we would love it if you give it a thumbs up, and if you're interested in all things autism, we'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow.